Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're taking a deep dive into something incredibly fundamental to your daily life, yet often invisible: how you actually experience the world around you.
Hmm.
We're talking about the amazing sort of automatic process where your brain takes raw input sights, sounds, textures, and builds the meaningful reality you perceive.
Exactly. And we've gathered some fascinating source material here, exploring not just the basics of how senses work, but crucially, how this process of making sense of things influences your behavior, especially,
Okay.
when you're interacting with others, like at work.
Right.
Think of it as understanding the hidden operating system behind your observations, interpretations, and reactions every single day.
Our mission in this deep dive is to pull out the most important nuggets from these sources. We want to reveal some surprising ways your own brain might be tricking you and show you why understanding this process is a real shortcut to being more well-informed, both personally and professionally.
Get ready to look at some familiar experiences in a completely new light as we explore that lightning-fast journey from physical energy hitting your senses to the vivid, meaningful world you inhabit.
So where do we start with this incredible journey from the outside world to our inner experience? How does it all kick off?
It all begins with what psychologists call sensation.
Okay.
This is a purely physical process. It's your sensory organs, eyes, ears, skin, nose, mouth receiving physical energy or chemical input from the environment.
Like light waves, sound waves.
Exactly. Pressure, chemical compounds. It's the raw data stream, really.
And then perception takes over. This is where the magic and sometimes, the confusion happens.
Right. It's your brain taking those raw sensations and actively selecting, organizing, interpreting, and giving meaning to them. It's turning abstract light patterns into the face of a colleague, maybe, or random noise into a crucial piece of information.
What's key, though, you mentioned, is that these aren't really separate steps happening one after the other.
No, not really. Our sources really emphasize they work together as one integrated system. Sensation brings in the data, but your brain is simultaneously deciding what to pay attention to and how to start organizing it almost instantly.
And this is where things get personal, right? Because while the sensation of seeing a bright light or hearing a loud noise might be physically similar for most people,
Your perception of that stimulus, what you focus on, what meaning you attach to it, how you react that is completely unique to you. It's shaped by your past experiences, your emotions, your culture, even your current needs and motivations.
this personal filtering system is exactly why two people can look at the exact same situation, the same data, and perceive it completely differently.
Absolutely. And it's also why we're susceptible to those fascinating things like optical illusions or maybe more importantly, misunderstandings about other people.
Okay, you mentioned there's a fundamental process that bridges the gap between the physical world and our brain's language. It's called transduction.
That's right, transduction. It's simply the conversion process. It's your sensory receptors taking that physical energy light, sound waves, pressure, and turning it into electrical signals.
The language of the brain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Signals that your nervous system and brain can understand and process. It's like translating from, say, physics to neurochemistry.
And it's important to remember our senses have limits. There's a minimum level of stimulation required for us to even pick something up, isn't there?
Yes, definitely. Psychophysics, that's the field that studies this link between the physical stimulus and our psychological experience, tells us about these boundaries.
Boundaries like thresholds.
Exactly. We talk about thresholds. The absolute threshold is the minimum amount of stimulation you need to detect something just half the time. Think about how dim a light can be before you can't see it at all, or how quiet a sound is before it just vanishes.
So if a signal at work, maybe an alarm or something, is below that threshold for someone.
It's essentially invisible or inaudible to them, even though it's physically present. And these thresholds vary person to person, situation to situation.
And then there's the just noticeable difference, or J&D. What's that?
That's the smallest change in a stimulus you can detect, again, about half the time. This is what they measure in things like hearing tests, finding the point where two sounds become just slightly different in pitch or volume.
I see. And there's a law related to this, Weber's law.
Yes, Weber's law. It gives us a really useful rule of thumb here. The amount of change needed to notice a difference isn't absolute. It's proportional to the original stimulus.
Okay, break that down.
So adding an extra kilogram to a backpack weighing just 5 kilograms, very noticeable, right?
Yeah, definitely.
But adding that same kilogram to a massive 200-kilogram weight, you probably won't even feel it. The proportion of change is tiny.
I get it. This principle must be used everywhere, like in marketing.
Oh, absolutely. Think about when a company subtly reduces the size of a snack bar. They're trying to make that change below your just noticeable difference so you don't perceive it negatively. Or, on the flip side, figuring out how much to improve a product feature so customers definitely perceive the improvement as valuable without, wasting money on changes that are too small to register. It's about hitting that differential threshold.
Okay, so beyond just detecting things, our brain has these amazing ways of processing all this incoming information. Let's talk about bottom-up and top-down processing.
Right. Think of bottom-up processing as building perception from scratch. Your brain starts with the raw sensory details, the lines, the colors, the specific sounds, and pieces them together to form a whole perception. It's purely data-driven.
Like hearing a completely new piece of music for the first time.
Perfect example. You're just processing the notes and rhythm as they come without any prior knowledge influencing it. Or maybe applying to a company you know absolutely nothing about, just going on the raw facts presented.
And top-down processing.
Top-down is driven by what you already know or expect. Your brain uses your past experiences, your knowledge, your context, your beliefs, your biases to interpret the incoming sensory data. It's concept-driven.
So if you hear just a few notes of a song you love,
Your brain uses your memory to fill in the rest and recognize it almost instantly. That's top-down. Or if you know something about that company you're applying to, you interpret the information through that existing lens.
so top-down processing is like your brain taking a shortcut based on experience, making an educated guess.
Precisely.
Ah.
And it's used much more often in daily life because it's incredibly efficient. We rely on it constantly. But, and this is important, it can also lead to misinterpretations if your expectations or your existing knowledge are wrong or biased.
That makes sense. Which brings us to another crucial concept, attention. I mean, all this raw data hitting our senses constantly, how do we not just get completely overwhelmed?
That's thanks to two key things: sensory adaptation and attention. Sensory adaptation is your senses becoming less sensitive to stimulation that's constant or unchanging.
Like getting used to the feel of your watch on your wrist, or the smell in a room.
Exactly. Or the hum of your computer. Your sensory receptors basically fatigue. Or rather, your brain decides the information isn't novel anymore.
So your brain essentially says, okay, this isn't changing, it's not important right now, I can ignore it.
Pretty much. It frees up your attentional resources to focus on what is changing, which is often much more important for navigating the world safely, or spotting opportunities or potential threats. Humans are really geared towards detecting change.
And that focusing is selective attention, right? The famous cocktail party syndrome.
Yes, that's the classic example. Your ability to tune into one specific conversation in a noisy room, effectively filtering out all the other conversations and background noise, it shows how powerful our attentional filter can be.
But it has a flip side, you mentioned.
It does. It's called inattentional blindness. When you're focusing intensely on one thing, you can completely miss other obvious things happening right there in front of you, even really salient things.
Like that famous experiment with the gorilla walking through the basketball game.
Exactly. People counting passes are so focused, they literally don't see the gorilla. Or think about a driver focused intently on their phone. They might completely miss the car braking just ahead.
Yeah.
Your attention is like a spotlight.
And whatever isn't in that spotlight might as well not exist for you at that moment. Wow.
It's a little unsettling, isn't it? Especially when you think about safety-critical tasks at work. Or, like you said, even just walking down a busy street. It highlights how even our most fundamental perceptual processes have these potential pitfalls.
Let's shift focus slightly, maybe to visual perception, because it's such a huge part of how most of us experience the world. Our brains don't just see individual lines and shapes and colors. They instantly organize them into meaningful objects and scenes. How does that work?
Absolutely. This is where the Gestalt principles of perception come in, based on the idea that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. Our brain seems to have these automatic built-in rules for grouping visual elements together in the simplest, most meaningful way.
Like figure and ground. That sounds fundamental.
It is. It's our automatic ability to separate an object, the figure, from its surroundings, the ground. You see the words on this page as distinct from the page itself. It relies on contrast. Without it, the visual world would just be a chaotic jumble. Think Rubin's vase illusion, where it flips between seeing a vase or two faces. That shows figure-ground switching.
Okay, what are some other Gestalt laws? Grouping things that are close together.
That's the law of proximity. If objects are near each other in space or time, we tend to perceive them as belonging together, as a unit. like seeing a cluster of people standing together on the street and assuming they're a group, maybe friends or colleagues.
Or things that look similar.
Law of similarity. We group elements that share visual characteristics like color, shape, size, or texture. Seeing people wearing the same uniform and instantly perceiving them as belonging to the same team or company. Or maybe seeing cars of the same make and assuming something about their drivers.
What about continuity?
Law of continuity. We tend to perceive smooth, continuous lines or patterns rather than disrupted or fragmented ones. It's why we see a winding road as one continuous path, even if parts are hidden by trees, or follow a line of cars and traffic as a single flow.
Enclosure. I think I know this one. Filling in the gaps.
Exactly. Our brain's tendency to fill in the missing parts of a figure to perceive a complete whole form, even if the sensory information isn't fully there. It's why you can recognize a familiar logo or a person's face, even if parts are obscured by shadow or another object. You only need sufficient clues.
It seems like these laws are really efficient for making sense of objects and scenes quickly. But do they also apply, maybe metaphorically, to how we perceive people?
They absolutely do. And this is crucial for social perception. Think about it. Seeing people who work near each other, proximity, and assuming they form a tight-knit group or clique, or judging someone based on the people they associate with.
Or similarity, assuming people with similar job titles or backgrounds, similarity, must have the same skills, attitudes, or beliefs.
Precisely. Or using closure, forming a complete impression of someone based on very limited information, maybe just how they look or one thing they said. Our brain uses these same organizational shortcuts when trying to make sense of the complex visual and behavioral input of human beings interacting. It helps us categorize quickly.
It can lead to stereotypes and quick judgments.
Exactly. We'll definitely come back to that.
Okay, visual perception also allows us to see in 3D, to judge depth, distance, height, width. How do we manage that?
Right. We use a combination of cues from our environment and our own bodies. There are monocular cues, which only need one eye to work.
Like what?
Things like relative size objects that cast a smaller image on our retina are perceived as farther away.
Oh.
Linear perspective parallel lines like roads or railway tracks appearing to converge in the distance. Text gradient textures appearing smoother and less detailed as they get farther away.
Okay. Interposition, too. If one object blocks another.
Yes, interposition or overlap. The object doing the blocking is perceived as closer. There's also atmospheric perspective. Things far away look hazier, less distinct. And motion parallax, when you're moving, closer objects seem to move past faster and in the opposite direction, while distant objects move slower and with you.
And then there are binocular cues, using both eyes.
Right. The two main ones are convergence, the degree to which your eyes turn inward to focus on a close object. The more they turn in, the closer the object is perceived.
You can feel that if you focus on your finger moving towards your nose.
Exactly. And retinal disparity, because your eyes are set slightly apart, each receives a slightly different image of the world. Your brain fuses these two images and uses the difference, the disparity between them, to calculate depth. It's especially important for judging distances of nearby objects.
Fascinating. And then there's perceptual constancy, this idea that we see objects as stable and unchanging, even when the sensory input hitting our eyes is changing dramatically.
This is absolutely vital for navigating the world. Think about a door. As it opens towards you, the actual shape projected onto your retina changes from a rectangle to a trapezoid to a thin line. But you don't perceive the door as changing shape, do you?
No, it still just looks like a rectangular door.
That's shape constancy. Or think about a friend walking away from you down a long corridor. The image they cast on your retina gets smaller and smaller, but you don't perceive your friend as actually shrinking.
Right, you perceive their size as constant. That's size constancy.
Exactly. Your brain automatically takes the changing retinal image and combines it with distance cues to maintain a stable perception of the object's real size and shape. There's also brightness, constancy, and color constancy, seeing objects as having consistent brightness and color even when the lighting conditions change significantly.
So our brain is actively working behind the scenes, constantly adjusting our perception to maintain a stable, predictable view of the world.
That's a great way to put it. It actively constructs this stable reality. It helps us navigate known and even unknown situations more effectively. There's even location constancy, perceiving stationary objects as remaining in the same place, even if we move our head or body.
But sometimes this active construction process gets it wrong, doesn't it? Which leads us to illusions.
Illusions are perfect examples of how perception is an active interpretation, not just a passive recording of reality. They happen when the cues our brain relies on are misleading, or when the stimulus itself has unusual properties.
Like that classic example of a stick appearing bent when it's partially submerged in water.
Yes, that's a physical illusion caused by the way light bends. Or the moon illusion, why the moon looks so much larger when it's near the horizon compared to when it's high in the sky. That's thought to be due to the way we interpret distance cues on the horizon.
And then there are those famous optical illusions, the ones designed to trick our visual system.
Right, perceptual optical illusions. Things like the Mueller-Lyer illusion, where lines of the same length appear different because of the arrowheads at the ends, or figures that seem impossible like the Penrose stairs or the two-pronged trident.
Why do they work?
They cleverly exploit the perceptual rules and assumptions our brain uses automatically, like interpreting angled lines as depth cues, or trying to apply principles like closure or continuity in misleading ways. They're powerful reminders that what you see isn't always objective reality. It's your brain's best guess based on the available information and its built-in processing rules. And sometimes that guess is wrong.
Okay, so if our perception of a simple stick in water or a drawn line can be wrong, or at least misinterpreted, how does this complex perceptual process fare when we apply it to something far more dynamic and ambiguous, like another human being?
Now we get into person perception or social perception. This is arguably the most fascinating and practically relevant area for most of us day to day. It's essentially applying all these perceptual principles, the organizing, the filtering, the interpreting, the shortcuts, the biases to other people.
And this is all about how we form impressions of others, right?
Primarily, yes, impression formation, how we gather, process, and interpret information about other people to form a judgment or a picture of who they are. And importantly, it also includes impression management, the ways we consciously try to influence how others perceive us.
And first impressions. They're incredibly powerful, aren't they? The sources really emphasize that.
Absolutely. Research consistently shows that first impressions are formed incredibly quickly, sometimes in less than a tenth of a second, just based on appearance or a brief interaction. And they tend to be very durable, very sticky.
Sticky.
They create an initial framework, or what psychologists call a schema, that strongly influences how you interpret everything else that person says or does afterwards. It sets the tone.
So a schema is like a mental blueprint or a category we slot people into. Friendly neighbor, tough boss, potential date.
Exactly. You build these schemas based on limited initial information, maybe their physical appearance, how they dress, their initial behavior, their job title, the context you meet them in. And these schemas contain your implicit beliefs and expectations about how someone fitting that category is likely to think, feel, and behave.
And once you have that schema in place, you might be more likely to notice things that confirm it and maybe unconsciously ignore or downplay things that contradict it.
Precisely. That's confirmation bias kicking in, working hand in hand with the initial schema. It makes us cognitive misers. Our brains generally prefer the easy route, sticking with the initial judgment rather than doing the hard work of constantly reassessing and updating our impressions, especially if the first one felt useful or made us feel comfortable.
And this links to the self-fulfilling prophecy too, doesn't it?
Yes, it's often a byproduct. Your expectations about someone, based on your schema, can subtly influence how you treat them, your tone of voice, your body language, the opportunities you give them. And that treatment can, in turn, actually elicit behavior from them that confirms your initial expectation.
Wow, that's a powerful loop. So if a manager goes into a performance review expecting an employee to be defensive, their own approach might actually make that employee defensive.
It's a very real risk. Your perceptual set, your expectations derived from that initial schema, are actively shaping the interaction, sometimes creating the very reality you expected to find.
What are some other common ways our perception of people gets distorted? These shortcuts gone wrong.
Well, stereotypes are a major one. These are essentially schemas applied broadly, often rigidly, to entire groups of people based on characteristics like gender, ethnicity, race, age, occupation, or any other group affiliation.
So they're cognitive shortcuts, again, saving time by lumping people together based on a category.
Exactly. They can feel efficient. But the problem is, stereotypes are almost always overgeneralizations. They're broad, often inaccurate, speculative, and completely ignore the vast diversity within any group. They lead to inaccurate perceptions and often unfair actions.
And they're notoriously hard to change, right? Even when you're presented with contradictory evidence, facts that don't fit the stereotype.
Very hard, because the stereotype itself acts as a filter for your perception. You're less likely to even notice or remember information that contradicts it, and you'll likely interpret ambiguous information in a way that confirms the stereotype. We see common ones related to gender roles, ethnic groups, even occupations. Think nerdy IT guy or aggressive salesperson.
And this leads to in-groups and out-groups.
Yes, we tend to form relationships based on these stereotypes and bias schemas. We favor our in-group, people we see as similar to us, and often view the out-group, people perceived as different, more negatively or homogeneously. They all look the same effect.
Which can escalate into prejudice and discrimination.
Sadly, yes. Prejudice is the ultimate bias here. It's an unfair, unfavorable, and often intolerant attitude or perception towards members of a specific group, usually based on negative stereotypes and strong negative emotions. Discrimination is the action unfair treatment based on that prejudice.
Where does prejudice come from?
It's complex. It can be learned through education, family norms, social environment. It involves beliefs, feelings, and behavioral intentions, often hostility stemming from perceived frustration or conflict. Some personality types might be more prone, like authoritarian personalities. Competition for resources, racism, and basic psychological needs can also fuel it.
How can it be reduced?
Education, promoting positive cross-cultural and intergroup contact, legislation against discrimination, trying to get people to recategorize groups or focus on integration. These can all help, but it's often a slow and difficult process.
Okay, moving on from stereotypes, what about the halo effect?
The halo effect. That's when your overall impression of a person is unduly influenced by one single prominent trait or characteristic, either positive or negative.
So if someone is very physically attractive, you might automatically assume they're also intelligent, kind, and competent, even if there's no evidence for that.
Exactly. The positive trait, attractiveness, creates a halo that makes everything else about them seem positive too. The "what is beautiful is good" stereotype is a classic example. Conversely, a negative halo effect can happen too. One negative trait, maybe they seem unfriendly initially, can make you unfairly judge everything else about them negatively.
So you're essentially building a whole, possibly inaccurate picture based on this one single brushstroke.
That's a good way to put it. It's a significant oversimplification. Then there's the contrast effect.
How does that work?
Your perception of someone is colored or contrasted by the people you encountered immediately before them. A job candidate who is merely average might look like a superstar if they follow several truly terrible candidates. Or a new acquaintance might seem exceptionally wonderful simply because they compare favorably to a difficult person you just interacted with.
It's all relative then.
In that moment, yes. And projection.
That sounds like something psychological.
It is. Projection is unconsciously attributing your own unacceptable or unwanted thoughts, feelings, motives, or characteristics onto someone else. Seeing your own insecurities, biases, or desires reflected in others.
Why do we do that?
It can sometimes alleviate anxiety about those traits in ourselves, but it seriously distorts our perception of the other person. We're not seeing them as they are, but as a reflection of our own inner world. It can be a defense mechanism.
This all paints a picture of perception being quite subjective and error-prone, especially with people.
It certainly can be, and it ties directly into how we make attributions, the explanations or inferences we make about the causes of events or behavior, both our own and others.
We're always trying to figure out why, aren't we? Why was that colleague late? Why did my manager give me that specific feedback? Why did that project succeed or fail?
Constantly. Humans seem to have a fundamental need to explain behavior, especially unexpected or unusual behavior, or events that have personal consequences for us. We want the world and the people in it to make sense.
How do we decide if someone's behavior is due to them, internal factors, or the situation, external factors?
Well, Harold Kelly's covariation model suggests we implicitly look for three kinds of information. First, distinctiveness. Does this person behave this way only in this specific situation or towards this specific person object, or do they behave like this generally? High distinctiveness points towards an external cause.
Okay.
Second, consistency. Does this person behave this way every time they're in this situation, or was it a one-off? High consistency suggests it's something stable, either internal or external.
And third,
Consensus. Do other people behave similarly in the same situation? High consensus, everyone else does it too, strongly suggests an external situational cause.
can you give an example? Maybe the canteen food one from the sources.
Sure. Imagine a colleague complains about the canteen food.
Right.
Is it just them? Low consensus. And do they complain about all food everywhere? Low distinctiveness. And do they complain every day? High consistency. Then you'd probably attribute it to them being difficult to please. Internal attribution.
But if everyone complains about today's food, high consensus. And this colleague usually likes the canteen food, high distinctiveness, and they consistently dislike this specific dish whenever it's served, high consistency.
Then you'd likely conclude the food is actually poor today, external attribution. We intuitively combine this information, often very quickly, to arrive at a cause. Though culture plays a role too, Western cultures tend towards internal attributions, while Eastern cultures often emphasize external factors more.
So attributions help us explain things, but like perception itself, they can be inaccurate, prone to errors.
Oh, absolutely. Attribution errors and biases are incredibly common. They relate to faulty judgments about whether the cause is internal or external. We often ignore internal factors if the behavior seems to fit the situation, but highlight internal factors if it doesn't fit.
What's the main one? The fundamental attribution error.
Yes, that's the big one. It's a pervasive tendency to overestimate the influence of internal personality factors and underestimate the influence of situational factors when explaining other people's behavior.
So if someone cuts me off in traffic, my immediate thought is, what a jerk. Internal attribution.
Rather than considering they might be rushing to a hospital or didn't see you or the road layout was confusing, external situational factors, we jump to character judgments for others. Think about company downsizing employees might see management as inherently selfish, internal, even if the decision was forced by economic circumstances, external.
How do we minimize that?
By consciously trying to consider the whole context, the potential situational pressures before jumping to conclusions about someone's personality.
And there's the actor-observer effect, too.
Yes, which is closely related. It's the tendency to attribute other people's behavior to internal factors, like the fundamental attribution error, but to attribute our own behavior, especially failures or negative actions, to external situational causes.
So he tripped because he's clumsy, internal, but I tripped because the pavement was uneven, external.
Exactly. Or they were speeding because they're reckless, but I was speeding because I was late science, where bait everyone else was, etc. It protects our self-image. It's a form of projection almost.
Which leads nicely into the self-serving bias.
Right. This is a prime example of defensive attribution protecting our self-esteem. We attribute our successes to our own good characteristics, our internal factors. I got the promotion because I'm talented and work hard.
But we attribute our failures to external factors. I missed the deadline because my team didn't support me. The requirements were unclear, bad luck.
Precisely. It makes us feel good about ourselves and look good to others. Entrepreneurs often show that success is due to their vision and skills. Failure is due to government regulations or market conditions.
And the just world hypothesis, blaming the victim.
Yes, this is another troubling bias related to defensive attribution. It's the tendency to attribute misfortune to the person who experienced it, essentially believing they somehow deserved it or had it coming, often without fully considering situational factors.
Why would we do that? It sounds harsh.
It stems from a belief, often unconscious, that the world is fundamentally just and fair. Good things happen to good people, and bad things happen to bad people. If something bad happens to someone, blaming them allows us to maintain that belief and feel less vulnerable ourselves. That wouldn't happen to me because I'm careful good.
So all these errors happen because we need to feel good about ourselves, explain the world, defend against negativity.
Largely, yes. The need for positive self-image, the desire for predictability and control, defending against negative perceptions, fear of loss, dealing with threatening situations, they all contribute to these perceptual and attributional biases.
So given all these potential pitfalls in how we perceive others, what about consciously managing how others perceive us? Impression management.
Yes, that's the other side of the coin. Impression management is a natural and often necessary part of interpersonal and social behavior. It's about trying to create the best possible image of ourselves, our team, or our organization in the eyes of others.
We do it everywhere, right? Job interviews, first dates, meeting the in-laws.
Absolutely. And it's especially prevalent in the workplace. Used to start, maintain, or expand business relationships, attract investment, build team morale, gain customer loyalty. Influencing employee and customer perceptions is absolutely key for business success. It shapes the organizational climate, the culture, brand reputation.
So it's used in marketing, politics, education.
Motivation, attitude change. Pretty much any situation where influencing perception matters. It applies to self-management, how you present yourself, and also to building the image of an entire organization. The goal is usually to project positive perceptions and try to avoid triggering those negative attribution errors or biases in others.
But there's a crucial caveat here, isn't there?
Yes, honesty and transparency are paramount. While we all engage in some level of impression management, relying on false or incongruent representations is usually unsustainable. The truth tends to come out eventually, whether you're dealing with employees, customers, or voters, and the backlash can be severe. Authenticity matters.
So what are some ways people try to enhance the impressions others form? The sources mention a few.
Right. There are self-enhancing behaviors, things like paying attention to your appearance, dressing appropriately for the situation, consciously emphasizing your positive aspects without bragging,
Yeah.
framing your faults as challenges you're overcoming, maybe name-dropping or highlighting associations with highly regarded people or institutions.
Okay. And ways to enhance others' impressions of you by focusing on them.
Yes, things like doing favors, offering help, getting involved, like sponsorships for organizations, making others feel good through honest compliments, being open and transparent with information, like clear company reports, competing ethically without discrediting others, and genuine networking showing real interest in others and their needs.
This ties into corporate image, too, the perception management wants the public and employees to have.
Definitely. The company's mission, vision, values statements, they're all part of crafting a desired image. People evaluate organizations as potential employers. Based on this image, is it seen as an employer of choice? Is it socially responsible? Problems arise when the image management wants to project doesn't match the reality perceived by employees or the public. That gap can be damaging.
So what does this all mean? We've taken a really deep dive into the incredible complexity of sensation and perception, how the raw world hits our senses, and how our brain actively, automatically constructs the reality we experience.
Yeah, and we've seen how this process, while often incredibly efficient, is deeply personal. It's subjective, profoundly influenced by who you are, your past, your beliefs, your needs, as well as the situation you're in and the nature of the stimulus itself.
And this shapes absolutely everything, from how you see a simple object to how you make complex, split-second judgments about the people you work with, often through these mental shortcuts like schemas and attributions.
Which, as we've discussed, often lead to fascinating and sometimes quite problematic errors, biases, stereotypes, misattributions.
Understanding these processes, these built-in filters and shortcuts, really helps explain why people can look at the same event or person and see completely different things, why those first impressions stick so hard, and why managing the impressions we create and being mindful of the impressions we form requires real conscious effort and, ideally, honesty.
It really highlights the difference between sensory input and perceived reality. They're not the same thing at all.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting then, the final thought to chew on. Given how much our perceived reality, everything from the color of a car to the intentions of a friend, is built through these subjective, interpretive, often automatic processes, how much of what you think is solid fact about the world, about other people, or even about yourself might actually be a fascinating, elaborate, and perhaps necessary illusion constructed by your own mind?
That is definitely something to think about. How much is real and how much is perception?